everyone, and welcome to our Tortoise newsroom. My name is James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder. Katie Fannick-Smith, my fellow co-founder, is here. Welcome if you're joining us too from wherever you are digitally. It's great to have you part of the newsroom online. We have, as you've seen there, a bunch of slides around energy demand and COP. We also today launched our Climate 100 Index. For those of you who follow Tortoise, one of the things we've tried to do is track what people say and what they actually do, track the behavior of the FTSE 100 companies against the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And when I say we, as is so often the case, what that actually means is other people. That means Alexandra Musavizadeh, my colleagues Patricia and Luke there, have been in a windowless room for about 3 months trying to make sense of what companies say and they do. And this C100 index, which we do in partnership with Teneo, is our way of trying to make sense of what's really happening as we go into COP. And in that spirit, I'm delighted that Dave Lewis is here. Dave, thank you so much for making the time. Because what I hope that we can do in the course of this coming hour is make a little sense of, I suppose, two of the three largest elements of what's going on in terms of our environmental, economic landscape. I.e., how do we make sense of the landscape of food? And how do we make sense of the landscape of energy? And I hope you know, if you haven't, some of you have been to Thinkings before, but for those of you who haven't, they're intended to be like a big editorial news meeting, i.e., there's a touch of chaos about them, and in the end, I hope, a redeeming order. You will bring the touch of chaos. Please weigh in with your thoughts, your points of view. If you've got points of view that are even kind of phrased as questions, please bring them in, bring them to Dave. What we'd like to do, though, is come out at the end of this hour with something that feels like a clearer sense of what to think. Because if I were to mark our own homework as Tortoise, as a newsroom, I think that we would say that we can quite quickly tell you exactly how we would see a subject as complicated as, for example, technology, freedom and society. We've kind of hammered out some thoughts on what to think about that. On some areas where, you know, issues are contested, even some areas around identity, I think we're quite clear about what to think. In and around the issues of climate, the critique that you could easily make of us is that we've done a lot to report the problem, really a lot to report the problem, but do we have a set of constructive answers as to what the solution should be? And I'd love to come away from this hour, if not with a blueprint, but with a few pointers. And so in conjunction with my colleague Giles Whittell, who's a fellow editor and partner here, and who for his sins writes our weekly Accelerating Net Zero sense maker, trying to make sense of this. We're going to try at the end, try and draw together everything that we hear. Please, if you're joining online, don't be shy, put your digital hand up, message us in the chat, and do weigh in. Here's the way I'm going to try and do it. It's not going to work because these things never do, but the way I'm going to try to do it is I'm going to sort of invite Dave to spend the first 20 minutes or so thinking about the food system and the environmental impacts of food. I then would love to go to energy and renewables and try and do the same. And then using my sort of system of maths, if we do 20 minutes on that, 20 minutes on the other, that should leave us with a handsome half an hour to do anything else that people want to talk about. So Dave, why don't we start? And start, if you would, by just giving us the scale of the food system's impact on the environment, biodiversity, and climate. And by the way, people, of course, know, because you're here, former CEO of Tesco, head of the World Wildlife Fund in the UK, now the chairman of Xlinks, which we'll come to in a moment. And I should also say, one of the people who both spiritually and intellectually has been a great supporter of Tortoise. Since he was last here, he got a knighthood and responsibility for the UK supply chain problems. So it kind of even out. Dave, talk to us about food.
Not related. Good evening, everybody. Well, look, let's start with some numbers then. Food system, global food system, between 30 and 35% of global greenhouse gases come from the food system. Okay. Together with energy, we'll talk about it in a second, you're getting close to 70% of all greenhouse gases come from two. A lot has been said about energy, less has been said about food. If you broaden that out a little bit, about 70% of the world's water, terrestrial water, is involved in the food system, and about 50% of all drinking water is involved in the food system in one way or another, which is pretty sad when you think also the food system is responsible for 75% of all water pollution in the world. And the other thing that's very, very disturbing, for reasons we might come on to, is a little bit more than 60% of the global biodiversity loss is driven by the food system. So two facts that might sort of put that into context for you, and this is with a WWF hat on. So since the year 2000, the food system has taken 1.9 million square kilometers of natural habitat and turned it into food production. It's about 8 UKs in terms of size. So what's been happening around the world is we take over nature to produce more food, to feed a growing population, but we destroy nature as we move further up the food chain into the green part of nature. And the other thing, by way of a kickoff, there's been no emissions reduction in global agriculture since 2008. Right, so whilst everything else has been working on emissions, actually the agriculture sector has not at all. And then finally, a subject that James and I have talked about before, if that's not enough as a thing to start with, a third of all the food that we do grow, we lose or we waste. Right? So food waste is massive. That's 1.3 billion tons of food that are grown every year doesn't get eaten. Right? If food waste were a country, it produces 8% of total greenhouse gas emissions, which would make it the third largest country after the US and China. Right? So there's quite a lot going on in the food system.
So can we do those one at a time, Dave?
Sure.
So why don't we say, and this is a bit blunt, but let's take land use, deforestation and biodiversity as one issue.
Okay.
Is there a world where actually there is a technology that's going to fix this? Vertical farming is going to fundamentally change the way in which agriculture happens, and so it's an investment issue, it's not necessarily a farming or land use issue?
So some and some. So the real solution is to adopt a more regenerative approach to agriculture. And part of that is technology, part of it is practice, part of it is behavior. And there are some really good examples of that in different parts of the world. And there are some good technology examples as well. So if you take two examples to try and illustrate that, we all know about the Amazon, we all know what the challenge is. So WWF with others set up something called the Cerrado Manifesto 4 years ago now, which was basically taking regenerative agriculture to the Amazon to help with soy production, right? Tesco and a number of others supported that. So it's possible to take existing areas of land and do it in a regenerative way, which actually doesn't destroy biodiversity and actually makes soil, nutrients, water, actually something that's not depleted as you, right? So whole set of solutions. And in the UK, if you want to look at some of the rewilding things that are happening in the UK, some interesting work going on there as well. On the other side of it, people talk about vertical agriculture, vertical farms. Actually, when you look at the economics of them, they're really challenged because most of them are having to generate the energy, right, in order to grow in enclosed spaces. Things that are more interesting, so an example, if you're interested, there's a company called DPS who have built a greenhouse, very large greenhouse on the south coast, which is basically what they would call stacked horizontal. They found a way of growing strawberries, in this case, on a Christmas tree that allows them to produce eight times the yield per square meter of how we normally grow strawberries, right? So there's some, again, closed root, small nutrients, no waste, very, very, very efficient use of technology to increase crop on small amounts of land, right? So there's solutions in both places if one wants to look.
All right, I'm going to skip through this because I want to hear from as many people as possible. So please, if you've got a thought on this, just on the food section, food and farming, please weigh in and don't be coy. If I see a hand, I'll come to you straight away. Let's do this. Sir, yes, good.
That was quick.
Yes, someone has to start. So will you just introduce yourself to everyone else?
Yes, Frederick Mebius. I'm actually a farmer, but I'm also heading an investment company called Planet First. On rewilding, I mean, I think it's a very interesting concept, but not one that really helps food production and feeding people around the world. So I think that one is really not one for other than, I would say, the bobos, maybe.
Well, I think I agree completely with what you say, but I think if you look at it from a systems point of view, I put a slightly different take on it. So if you take the UK, if we took 21% of the least productive land in the UK, right, it produces 3% of all the calories are consumed, right? If you believe that actually rebuilding nature is one of the things that can actually contribute to a nature positive environment climate agenda, then taking that 21% of that currently used for food land and rewilding in the way that you see in Scotland and other places, actually in terms of the total system, it's a huge contribution.
Totally agree, but I think regen agriculture is much more promising.
We agree.
To continue to produce goods for the people.
Completely agree.
Can I just make one point? I'm glad you agree. I don't actually even understand what regenerative agriculture is. What is that?
I think if we keep it simple, people define it in different ways. The whole idea is making sure that you don't take anything away from the nature that produced the land in the first place. So from a soil health point of view, you don't deplete the soil. From a water point of view, you don't actually pollute or lose the water. So it's basically trying to close.
Who judges that? Who oversees?
There's a whole bunch of different. One of the issues for the UK at the minute, there's about 3 or 4 different groups. You're nodding. Who are trying to accredit different ways of judging regenerative agriculture. Prince Charles is heavily involved in trying to get one. There are 2 or 3 others.
Right. Okay.
I would say the issue with regen agriculture is that the consumer doesn't taste the difference.
Correct.
Whereas for organic food, it's a very simple message.
Correct.
It's no pesticides, no herbicides. Regenerative is a little more complicated. You don't deplete, but you still use sides, which is a challenge for the consumer and for the branding of the product.
Can I ask just one thing before I just want to touch on, I do want to get to waste and to emissions, but just in this description, is it fair to say that this new version of farming, whether it's regenerative, whether it's the application of your kind of stacked horizontal, is going to be much more capital intensive, i.e. that your farmers are going to have to come at this with a level of resources that many of them don't have? And there's going to be an economic equality issue here in modern farming.
I don't think so. I think there are certain things. So I've given you a strawberry example because you asked about vertical farming. Yeah. There's an element of capital involved in that, but in the scheme of things, it's not huge amounts of capital. The thing that's particularly, so if you talk about regenerative agriculture and you put it together with diet, you get to some interesting and for some people controversial points, which is most of the agricultural land or land that we give over to growing food is for livestock, right? So actually the ability to think about a conversion from, and not controversial in farming circles, is actually we produce, it's very inefficient, the land that we use versus the calories that are produced. So actually if you move from livestock to more plant-based and others, it's not capital intensive, but it would be better in terms of health and it would be better in terms of regenerative use of the land.
And Dave, those people on that 21% of land that are producing the 3% of calories, presumably that's not very economic for them either.
No, well, James, both the problem and the opportunity. So the way that the Common Agriculture Policy worked, if you think in the EU, some of the incentives that were put in weren't about productivity, weren't about quality, weren't about environment, weren't about... So actually, the productivity of that land and the economic support for the land wasn't really about the turnover, it was more about subsidy and the way that farming was incentivized.
Can I just
go ahead. No, get involved. No, this is the way it's supposed to work.
I think the great opportunity is to be able to demonstrate the link between regen agriculture, carbon capture, or the carbon that you can sink in the soil, and the quality of nutrients. When we will be able to make that link, regen agriculture will be the only way that people will want to farm.
So in this world, presumably you have some government agency that has oversight of all of your inputs and all of your outputs as a farm.
Yes.
Okay. Can we do waste for a moment?
Sure.
So this idea, US-China food waste, right? What would you do to reform that?
Well, look, you and I have had this conversation before. So there's a UN group called Champions 12.3. It was convened to champion the delivery of that SDG. And the idea is to reduce food loss and waste by 50% by 2030. So I chaired that for I founded and chaired that for the first 3 years. So there's a coalition around the world, which are governments and businesses that are committed to doing exactly that. So there's a whole series of different interventions and best practice, which is shared around food loss and waste.
And is this, sorry, I hope I'm not bellowing too much, but is this a kind of ultimately also a market incentivized change, i.e. companies will do it, to look good, to compete, or is this going to have to be done through a big regulatory intervention?
Well, I think just to dive into food waste just for a second, if everybody knows this. So as I say, 1/3 of all food that's produced is lost or wasted. 1 in 9 people go to bed hungry at night. It costs $940 billion a year to support it. There's a good
how much?
$940 billion. So there's a very strong commercial case. So there's a business case that we did for 12.3, which shows for every dollar invested in reducing food waste, the payback is $14. There's a very good economic case. There's a very good moral case, given what I've just said about. But the other one that's interesting, which we were pushing, is no country in the world puts reduction of food waste in their NDCs environmentally.
Wow.
Right.
Why? Because they don't get the credit for it.
Well, they don't measure it.
Oh, I see. I'm just going to pick up a couple. So I'm going to come to you in a moment. I'm going to come to Luke, my colleague, if I might.
Thanks a lot. I was just going to say on the point of food waste and the value thereof.
Yeah.
That's not just a cost to us, but it's also income for the businesses that are generating the food and the sales. So the end kind of location or destination of the food, whether it's our bin or our belly, it doesn't actually matter to a business's bottom line. So if they're not necessarily to incentivize to reduce waste by changing the way that we buy the food, in what quantities or what packaging. And I did read something quite interesting about an experiment that Amazon were thinking about, which was having a very sort of data-led measurement of people's food consumption through Amazon shopping, and basically just sending them the food that they needed at the cost that it would cost them. But that has a big profit impact.
Look, what you say is absolutely right. So just to broaden that out a little bit, if we take the UK and you look at food loss and waste through the whole chain, about 65% of all the food that's wasted is after somebody's bought it. Okay, so domestic, right? In the more, if I use the word developing part of the world, it's actually 65 years lost post-harvest, pre-purchase, right? So the interesting thing is, and what you see in the UK, because actually there's a good news story in the UK around this is, so if I take my Tesco example, exactly to your point, so every Tesco store in the UK now has, with Fair Share and something called Food Cloud, the ability at the end of every day, any food that's not sold, that's still safe to be eaten, but legally you couldn't put out the next day, is offered up to local charities. And they come and pick it up, and it's distributed into social projects in that community. So as a result of doing something like that, to James's question of, is there something you can do? This is a year out of date. I've not been there for a year. In that last year, 84% of food which otherwise would have been wasted was redirected to human consumption in the UK through that measure. There's an awful lot you can do in the system to do exactly what you said. And as a business, why the hell wouldn't you want to, for the reasons you say? The bit we've not worked hard enough on is actually after somebody's bought it and taken it home, what do they do? And that's the behavior change thing. And the really interesting thing was, the very first time that's come down in the last decade was the first lockdown. Food waste went down 27% in the home in the lockdown because people started planning meals again, eating all the food. And I could only go shopping once, so I thought about the meals and all that. So it was really quite interesting that was the first time it came down. But your point is absolutely spot on.
God, that's a hot, chilling commentary, not just on food, on the way we live our lives. Sort of stop and breathe. I'm going to come back to your woman. I'm going to just come to this gentleman, and then I'm going to, George, if I might, I'm going to come to Gabby, my colleague online. So
fascinating. My name's Eric Benedict. I'm with Alex Partners, though I think here in a personal capacity. Tax, it's slightly off to one side, but running through my head is something that Alan Jope said at one of your interviews about if one thing comes out of COP, it's a move towards carbon tax. What do you think of that? Does it help? I then think about what I read at the weekend about it's about time we put tax on meat to try and change habits. And I was very struck, and I don't know what to think about all this. I just put it out there. Is it Lord Debon who said it's crazy that we've just done this deal with New Zealand, Australia to ship lamb halfway around the world? What on earth are we trying to do here? But on the other hand, free trade and a resurgent UK, et cetera, But it seems to me underneath it all, tax somehow may be an important lever to try and make some changes happen. Just thoughts on that.
Okay, great. Carbon tax, meat tax, globalization and climate. Thank you, Eric. Yeah.
Look, I think if you ever get a chance, the National Food Strategy that I was involved in behind the scenes does some of the best analysis of the UK food system I've ever seen. It puts together land, health, consumption brilliantly. It has not found favour because the two things it led with in terms of recommendations were tax driven. Right, so politically, I'm going to leave whether you think tax is a good thing or a bad thing here. Politically, taxing meat, taxing sugar, taxing fat, which were all the things that is seen as being politically completely unpopular, right? So I think on the day that National Food Strategy came out, the Prime Minister said very clearly, I'm not up for taxing people for the food that they eat, right? So whether taxation can work or not, I find, look, my experience with the sugar tax was, it was brilliant at forcing the industry to reformulate. Didn't raise any money in terms of taxation, but actually it forced industry to reformulate. That wouldn't be the same with meat or others. You'd just basically be changing the price, and politically not acceptable in the UK. I agree with Alan. We could have a long conversation about it. I think at some point we have to put a price on carbon. COP has been talking about it for a very long time. People like Mark Carney and others have been working on it for a very long time. It's hugely contentious. It's very, very difficult. But I'm intrigued by, you will have seen what's happened at Exxon. Really, really interesting. There's a very good paper, I've forgotten who written it, about the carbon short, which is basically put a notional price on carbon. So I think the numbers, don't quote me on the numbers, but there's something like, if you say it's $100 and you look at the emissions of Exxon, then actually the carbon cost is greater than their earnings. So at what point as a board, and I think they changed the composition of the board by challenging the fact that they weren't doing enough to think about that carbon cost that was going to come at some point. Now, how it works, better brains than me have been working on it, but at some point, nature's not for free. And we need to start pricing in. The Dasgupta report is fantastic in terms of challenging us on what it is we've taken for granted and we think is free, but actually has a consequence that we don't factor into our decisions. But how it actually works on carbon tax, let's see.
Dave, I'm going to, Eric, I realise there's a fair bit there and there's the kind of New Zealand lamb, but we're going to come back to that in a moment, just because my colleague Phoebe's here, Katie as well, and then there are a couple of comments online. I'll come to you in a moment, Charles. Phoebe.
So I'm going to do a plug. We did a SenseMaker audio on birth rates this week that I wrote. Check it out. But also, what was interesting was population. You mentioned it, right? How can we have this? Can we have this conversation without talking about population? Because is there an accountability? We can do all we want with the farm. We can all we do want with the land. We can do vertical. But if the numbers of people are going up, surely at some point that something must switch. And how can we have this kind of conversation when at the same time, China's turned around and said, we want more people, we need more people, we need more working age people, we need more kids, then how can we have the same conversation? Yeah,
and you know how controversial some of the conversations are around. I think the bit that I can comment on is it is absolutely possible, if we take the technology that exists and share it around the world, to be productive enough for the population we've got without having the environmental impact that we're currently having. Right. So the big thing, I use the example of food loss and waste. The really interesting thing of running the global Champions 12.3 was for 65% of the world, the big issue was post-harvest losses before it got anywhere near a human being, if you like. Whereas in the more developed part of the world, actually it was after it was bought. If you transfer the skills that have already been learnt upstream in the supply chain from one part of the world to the other, so we got, France to support Africa, we got others to support Indonesia on rice, we got PPPs that work in that. You can take technology and you can work it to such an extent that the agricultural productivity, without needing to keep taking more land, can support the population we have. What that means for the population that might grow thereafter, I grant you, but I focus my work was on how do we, with the population we have and the resources we have, do that in a much better way. And that is eminently doable. Right.
Dev, I'm going to take a couple of points. Katie, and then we'll come to Giles, and then a couple of points on screen. Katie.
I love Joanna Lumley, and she was in the Times today talking about climate credits and how everyone may end up in a world where they have climate credits. And when you were just talking about the lockdown effect, and it just struck me like ration books. Now, you could never have ration books because obviously that's taking away. But is there a system or a solution around credits, like a reward-based way of thinking about consumer change that actually might help that behavioral change that we actually know that all of these things end up coming back to? So it's not a ration book.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a credit system, and I don't know what that looks like, or if you have thoughts on it.
Well, when I first started my career at Unilever, I was involved in the UK in the first sort of emissions credits, and we trade between businesses. There was a trading scheme way back then that then defunct. I think there's definitely something. I suspect the market will be the business. So the carbon markets that we were talking about before will be where businesses ultimately engage. The biggest question is, what can you do with consumers? What can you do with people in terms of changing behavior? And we could talk at length about the number of different things that have been tried and are being tried. The two things that are really hard at the moment, this is not an excuse, but just they've all fallen over for one of two reasons. One is we're very good at regulating what goes on in supermarkets because it's relatively straightforward and the supply base is known. We're really very poor out of home. And so if you want to understand and change behavior in terms of how people eat, it needs to be education that goes across the food chain. We eat, on average, 50% of the food we eat is outside of the home, not bought in a supermarket. And actually, we have none of the rules about what the dietary requirements are there. So any scheme has to go across both, because otherwise you have no impact. So there was a scheme that we, Tesco, a few others, Danone and what have you, did in two boroughs in South London, and changed everything that was in the stores. Had a really interesting impact in the stores, no impact in the community, because actually next to the stores was the pizza shop and so actually the consumption didn't change. So that's been so I'd like to say yes. Everything that's been tried so far hasn't worked, and it hasn't worked for this one discontinuity in terms of how people are communicated about food. Mm-hmm. The only one that seems to be working, this will be controversial, is the Chinese one. Yeah.
The social credit system.
No, the Clean Plate Initiative.
What's that?
We took, as 12.3, the biggest issues we had were how would we get China, India, and the US to engage as countries? For years and years and years, banging our head against a brick wall. And then China came out with something called the Clean Plate Initiative. So as the government came down on lots of things that were happening in China in terms of excess, called out, because the ceremony is to feast and banquet, you know very well. So and came out with a Clean Plate Initiative that said actually we should only serve food to the point where actually you clean your plate. Massive impact.
Interesting. Right? That is interesting.
Anyway.
George, do you want to come in now, or do you want to wait a bit? Come in now.
Very briefly on carbon pricing. Every conversation that we have about this comes back to that. And you say it's very complicated. But is it possible that actually, if you park the idea of a global carbon price as being very complicated and as needing new mechanisms, and focus on nationally based taxation as a mechanism for carbon pricing, that actually it's much more doable?
Look, I think it is, but to be honest, having a national solution to a global problem is difficult, right? So if we did something in the UK, the global impact of that in terms of climate change would be relatively small. So I think if you talk to Mark Carney about this, he believes, and I have some sympathy with him, that at some point you have to use the global financial markets as a way of really leveling the playing field and making a substantive change.
Can I just do one thing? We're going to turn to energy in a moment, but George, if we might, can I just bring in my colleague Gabby, because there's one note that we haven't hit in this conversation so far at all, which is around consumption itself. Gabby.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinarily basic, and I appreciate that we obviously live in a fundamentally capitalist society, but when will the retailers stop trying to sell so much stuff? Like, if we just encourage people to buy fewer things and need less items, feels like very simplistic, obviously, might solve some issues.
No, it's not. It is a really good question. I think to put it into context, so in 1975-80, that 5-year period, the money that a household spent on its food consumption was 22% of its disposable income.
Say it again?
So the money that it spent on, the average household spent 22% of disposable income on food, right? It's now about 7%. So actually the food industry in the UK has done a phenomenal job of making good, healthy, affordable food cheaper and cheaper and cheaper relative. And the big question is, at some point, does that change? Now, I'm on dangerous territory here about what I'm going to say, is the idea, though, that we talk about food, the solution to food being actually we make it more expensive or we reduce the volume that's available is really difficult, right? Because there are 20%, there are still more than 20, given the facts I've just given you, there are still 20% of people in the UK for whom food is 74% of their disposable income, right? By the way, the top 30% of incomes in the food is less than 5% total food, right? So every time I have the thing on policy and people say, well, eat less, make it more expensive, that's okay for people perhaps sitting in central London, if you know what I mean. But there's still a very big group of people for whom food is still all about subsistence. And
so just to one section on food, almost exactly a year ago, we were holding a conversation like this with Justin King, the former chief executive of Sainsbury's. And he made the argument, he said, equally nervously, he said, there is an argument for putting VAT on food and then creating an exemption for people in some version of food poverty to deal not only with a tax issue and a revenue issue, but also fundamentally with the food waste issue. Do you have any interest in that?
Look, I think I go the other way, to be honest. I don't think it's about VAT. I think to where the question was, one of the decisions we took in Tesco was to take away multi-buy promotions on fresh food. Because what the mechanic was basically the best price you got was if you bought 3 of them. Right, so you buy 3 for the price of 2, you take them home, the third one actually gets wasted in the fridge and doesn't get eaten, then actually why not lower the price of the single unit and stop promoting? So I think the interesting thing is there is a consumption effect in promotions. So if you wanted to do it, I'd actually disincentivize promotions, get to an even pricing on food, allow people the easiest point of access to good, healthy, affordable food, and actually not play with tax and credits. And
that's just really interesting to me, just because you're talking about something that is so behavioural and obviously driven by the conduct of the supermarket itself. Is there a measure, just out of interest, of food waste by supermarket? I.e., who's the worst?
I can't tell you the worst.
Okay, who's the best then?
No, so all of the supermarkets now measure based on 12.3. Only Tesco publish. Right, and we publish. We
knew that, did we?
Yeah.
Luke knows that.
I saw in your thing today, which I need to find out. I saw that they didn't report this time, right? Which is, I saw that. Not
Tesco
good.
drop,
Gonna
not good.
Gonna have a word.
Patricia, you wanted to say something?
Food waste.
They do put food waste. So, do you want to do food?
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to get something you said about disposable. Oh, sorry.
I wanted to go back to something you said about the disposable income, that 22% of disposable income was, I don't know what year it was spent on food, and now it's 7%. Did that prove that the UK food industry had done a good job at making good, healthy food more affordable?
I don't immediately see that from that statistic. People are maybe not eating very healthily. They're just not spending as much on food. They're eating lower quality, mass-produced, more processed, and not spending time making their food with raw ingredients. They're buying packaged, easy, time-saving stuff. So how do you know that they're having a good, healthy, affordable, more healthy, affordable food?
So I think we're both right. So what happens is when you...
That's always good.
When you break down those numbers I've seen and you look at it, so if you were to look at the cost of red meat, fruits and vegetables, fish during that time, they've actually come down in real terms, right? But you're also right that actually over that time, ready meals, processed food, other things have grown as well, right? So both things have happened. So the interesting thing, where that takes you to is the third bit of the whole food system. So there's regen agriculture, the avoidance of waste, and changing diet. And actually, changing diet is a really big but difficult thing to do. And that goes to your point about what is the composition of food. And again, if you look at the National Food Strategy, there's some really good work on composition of diets and what's happened in terms of that change in composition and the fact that people are eating more of the processed foods that you talked about. But it doesn't stop the real price of core food getting cheaper over the period that I said.
But also it's not helpful that then people are eating more and more red meat, given what you said about land use and...
And this is true, and hence how do you refer it? But back, if you went into if you go back to the 1980s, the number one requirement or desire of people in the UK was access to red meat. If I think about the house I grew up in, we didn't have steak in our house, so making steak affordable. You know, the whole supermarket thing was making the unattainable accessible, and so they built a system that made red meat. You know, I think, don't quote me on the numbers because I'm a bit out of date, about 25% what it was, 10 or 15 years ago, right? So, but now we're saying, actually, we probably don't want that much red meat. Now, how do we move away from it?
So will you forgive me? And so I'm going to come to you, and Zal, I can see at the back too, but I'm doing an absolutely lousy job on timekeeping. And I really would like to get to this energy question. So I know people have thoughts about food. Let's come back to them. We can do that informally once we're done. But the reason for it is, I'm inviting, Dave, just to do a sort of party political broadcast for Xlinks, right? The reason being that it feels to me as though it gets at some of these fundamental questions about can renewables work, can renewables meet baseload, does government help incentivize renewables or does it get in the way? So you'll do a better job than me of describing what it is, and then we'll tuck into whether it can work.
Okay, so best way of doing that then is 2018, Modi gave a speech to the UN called One World, One Sun, One Grid, right? And the insight there was the sun shines somewhere in the world all the time. And if you could capture the power of the sun and connect it to the point of where energy was needed in real time, then the sun is a massive solution to the energy requirements of the world. There are other examples. I think Forbes have said, 1% of the Sahara could power the world. There's some manipulation in that number, but the idea that the sun is a source of power, the issue is it doesn't shine where you always want the point of consumption. So what's really interesting is, so Xlinks is a business that was set up by a man called Simon Moorish. Simon's an entrepreneur, and it's all about how do you capture and connect the power of nature. And so this is a project that I got involved in after I finished at Tesco. It will, so with the Moroccan government, has secured an area of the Sahara Desert, which is about the same size as Greater London. So 1.5 or 1,500 square kilometers. And on that site, we'll put a solar farm and a wind farm and connect it directly to the UK national grid through HVDC underwater cables, right? What that will do is allow the UK to have access to 8% of its total electricity requirements, which is about 7 million homes, if you want it in that number, completely emissions-free, very reliable renewables, which we'll come back to given James's question, and it's half the price of the nuclear option that the government is currently investing in. So that's the project, right? A couple of things you should know is all the technology there is proven. There's already a 3,300, 1.1 million volts cable that's going east to west in China, been running since 2019. The UK has just opened a subsea link to Norway using the same technology, and those sorts of interconnectors are there. So there's nothing difficult in terms of the technology. The thing that's particularly interesting about this is renewable energy in the UK is notoriously unreliable. Right? So at the moment, wind is 30% of our energy requirements, but anybody who's been following it earlier this year, when the wind doesn't blow, have a guess what, there is no energy. And actually, in global terms, from a weather system point of view, when the wind doesn't blow, it basically doesn't blow over most of where we've got wind farms. So it's not like you lose a little bit, you lose all of it. The thing that's really interesting about Morocco and the Sahara is two things. It is 3 times more productive in terms of its energy conversion per square meter, given the sun. But the other thing that I'm embarrassed I'd forgotten from my O-level geography is that every day, after the sun has risen and warmed everything up, as it moves across the convection currents means that the wind blows every day. So by putting a solar farm, so it's 7 gigawatts of solar, it's 3.5 of wind, and a small amount of battery capability, you can basically generate 3.6 gigawatts of energy, or transmit 20 hours a day. And that would be at the time when the UK needs it most, with none of the intermittency, because it happens every day. So it's renewable that behaves like baseload.
So I'd love to, so there's a really interesting element of this, which is, forgive me, is like seriously nerdy, which is contract for difference. Right. And I ended up having a conversation with Jonathan, forgive me, Jonathan, I don't betray conversation around contracts for difference in the energy sector.
Yeah. Okay.
And just so, I'm going to give my very rough explanation of this, but essentially, in order to guarantee energy generation, the government steps in and said, look, we'll fix a price, or the generator fixes a price, and the government says, look, when the cost of generation or the revenue from generation falls below that, we'll step in, and when it goes above that, you have to pay the excess back to us, right? And the problem at the moment, as I understand it, is that there's not a clarity on government commitment around those contracts for difference. If you're Xlinks and you're proposing to bring in, 7 million homes worth of energy, or I think if you're Drax, you don't necessarily know what your future commitments are. So can you just tell us, if you were sort of king for a day, if you were able to set government policy so that there was proper investment at scale for these kinds of renewables, what you need from government to make it happen?
Okay. So look, I think it's fair to say, this is all new to me, but actually, first and foremost, I'm actually going to say the government's done quite a good job, right? So there are 3 buckets for contract for difference, right? So offshore wind, there's an innovation bucket. So there are 3 buckets under which you can apply. They do it on a competitive basis. And the reason why I say it's interesting is that the competitive tension in CFDs is part of the reason why the cost of wind power through government contracting has come down by 80% over the last 10 years. So actually, those CFDs have worked very well. So within the 3 buckets, it's really clear how it works. And for those who are not familiar, I'm not an energy expert, this is a big steep learning curve for me. The reason you want, because it's got such a large capital, you need a revenue which is long. So 15, 20, sometimes 25 years in order to raise the capital. And the only way you'll raise capital in the market is you have some certainty that the government's not going to change policy midway through and make so that's what it is. And they've done a really good job of that. Within those 3 buckets, brilliant. Now the problem is, when it's not in those 3 buckets, challenging. So Xlinks doesn't fall in one of those 3 buckets. It's not offshore wind, because it's onshore in Morocco. It's not in the North Sea, it's in another country. So it starts to challenge the paradigm on which those CFDs have been tidal. There's an innovation for some new, that's it, but it's tiny. It's not as big as the scale that we're talking here.
And can I just one other element of this, which is, you mentioned HVDC cables, right?
Huge.
But these are basically like big piece of cable, I guess. And
very technical.
Okay, so we're now at my level, right? So you've got a big solar panel in the Sahara, and you've got a wind thing, and then you've got a cable.
Yeah.
And then my understanding is that you're going to need about 15,000 kilometers worth of cable, and all of the thick cable manufacturer is already taken, right? So you're going to need to build your own cable manufacturing business up on the west coast of Scotland. But then you'll have a big cable manufacturing business that could serve other, you know, does that all seems rather exciting to me. That seems like, okay, we could become a leader in a new kind of business that presumably is going to be needed in more and more places. How does that work? Is there someone who comes in and says, okay, look, we'll pump prime that, we'll help that happen, or not?
The two things are connected. So to put some of the substance on James's point, there are 3 manufacturers in Europe that have all of the capacity for HVDC cables. Their order books are full between 4 and 5 years out from here. The demand for cabling is through the roof, is absolutely through the roof because of the interconnectors I've just talked about. The cable that we need is 3,800 kilometers long, but there will be 4 of them, hence the 15,000. At the minute, total global production is between 4,000 and 5,000 kilometers, so Xlinks needs all of it for 4 years. So the idea is actually much more affordably, but into the UK, is build our own factories. So we'll build our own factories. There'll be 3 of them. It might be 1, it might be 2. We might just do one very big one in Unterston and other one in Port Talbot. But they'll create about 1,400 sort of high-tech manufacturing green jobs in the UK. But for the first 4 years, they're going to be busy doing the Xlinks project. At that point, they'll be primed and ready to play in the global cabling market and any other projects that Xlinks does.
And do you need to tap public money to make that happen?
We're raising money for both of them. So Xlinks XLCC, it will be a standalone cable business.
Right.
We'll probably need between 800 million and 1 billion to build those 3 factories. Planning permission is underway in both Hunterston and Port Talbot. And ideally, middle of next year, we'll start building.
So I feel we got a little bit into the weeds, or even the seaweeds of this. Is it just in the way in which you set out, Dave, a kind of view on the food system, what the problem is, what needs to happen? Do you feel on energy that you've got a grip on that now, that between renewables, nuclear, sort of existing fossil fuels, what the mix should be, and how public and private money should get there?
I think actually the government scenarios, I spent a little bit of time a few weeks ago with National Grid looking at their scenarios going forward. Look, everybody's clear about fossil fuel. Nobody wants to go back there, but at the moment, because we have 30% of our wind, which is intermittent, you need to keep that capacity there. When wind fails, you have to go back, which did happen this year for the first time in a while. So what National Grid would say is, look, the idea of moving 30 to 70% wind would be fine. They worry that when you get to 70, if it doesn't blow, then you've really got an exposure. So what's the backup? At the moment, nuclear is the backup, but nuclear is very expensive and timely, and we're going to go through a stage where we take nuclear off. So the idea that you could put something together which was intermittent wind, absolutely bankable renewable, some nuclear, and then we've got some biofuels and other stuff. That looks like a model that you could go forward, but it requires the government in the innovation strategy to think differently about renewables.
I'm going to come, I don't know whether or not, I'm coming back to you in one moment, Frederick, because I just want to make sure I get on point, and I'm coming to this lady first, if I might, and I'll come back to you, Frederick. Yeah.
Hi, Claire.
Hi, how are you?
Hello.
I'm a lawyer, so ask a question on risk. What about country risk, Dave, with this nuclear's onshore?
Yeah, great. It's a great question. So there are probably 3 ways of answering the question, Claire. So let's talk about the pipeline. Let's talk about some of the geopolitical stuff. So Morocco is probably, so the UK would say that Morocco is probably the best trading partner in North Africa by quite some distance. We have about $1.5 billion of trade, and there's a good relationship between the two. So, but clearly on ground security would be important. But Morocco has decided, it has a government policy, which is they want to be a renewable superpower. They already export 4,000 megawatts of power. They've got solar farms in the Sahara. So it's very much in their interest to make sure that that's a secure, reliable relationship. From a UK point of view, look, at the moment, we have risk in our exposure for where we get our power from now, right? So actually, if you think of it in terms of game theory, one more option improves the resilience of the energy system for the UK. you have vulnerabilities, for sure you do, but at a macro level, one other source would actually make the whole system more resilient. And the other bit is the way that the cabling is done, because actually it's 700 meters deep, it's also buried under the seabed, so it's buried, means that none of the issues of trawlers and anchors and other things actually disturb it en route, which is one of its big advantages. But you can never say it's no risk, but actually at a macro level, all the people who are managing energy security like the extra optionality that it brings.
So are you concerned about an element of risk?
Well, I was just going to say we have a very good bilateral treaty, part of our business, if it's worth talking to them about that.
But Dave, can I sort of take that point? Because there are 2 points in the chat as you were talking, one from Tom Schuler, one from Bradley Shippey, which I think actually kind of should open our eyes a little bit to the new kind of geopolitics of renewable energy in a way in which we got used to Saudi and oil.
Yes, indeed.
So Tom makes the point, what's your threat from Boko Haram and militants of that style in that area? And then Bradley Shippey makes a point, which is the Xlinks map, I imagine looking at the map online, Xlinks map shows the Western Sahara fully incorporated into Moroccan territory. Makes the point very neatly, interesting, ...
I noticed whoever adjusts, so it's not, right? So
okay.
We're not in the contested area at all.
I see.
So we're not. So we should just make sure that.
Okay, well, I'm glad we cleared that up.
Yeah, so that's not the issue.
But what about the issues that you are going to face?
Yeah,
we're going to face a different kind of set of energy politics and security risks, aren't we?
And look, again, to the point which is, whilst this is quite an audacious project and it's quite a scaled project, it's not new. So, as I say, in Morocco already there are 4 very large solar installations. So, bit of a diversion. So, the Saudis have a business called Aqua Power. Anybody know Aqua Power? From zero now has $65 billion worth of renewable assets under management. Right? Interesting. Quite a lot of those are in Morocco and North Africa and other places. The Moroccan government have decided what their economic strategy is, and they've realized that the Sahara, whilst it was wasteland, their words not mine, now is a very valuable resource if you can capture the electrons and export them. So there's a huge economic incentive for the Moroccan government to actually protect and grow this industry. They've got themselves to about 55% renewable for themselves, and they want to carry on, and then they want to export, because we're touching a fraction of the resources that are there. So I can't say to you there's no risk, but we can't say that about an oil pipeline or a gas pipeline today. But there's a very strong desire from Morocco to become a reliable partner in this space.
Can I say, well, the mic, if it can go to Jonathan there in the purple jumper. Have you got it, Marion? Oh, there. Thank you very much. Sorry, then I'll come back to you, Tommy, in a second. Jonathan, can I just ask one thing? Just because Zebedee Albi in the chat raised a good point, which is to say, look, this is a commercial venture, Xlinks. To an extent, you're making the case for it, you're marketing it. How do people who are now being required to make judgments on essentially the viability of these projects, the economic good sense, the environmental impact, how do politicians, who are probably like a lot of us in this room, who really didn't know anything about this issue 5 years ago, to be trusted to make good judgments on whether or not these kinds of commercial undertakings are worth backing?
So first and foremost, with something with this longevity, you never have a perfect answer. So all you can do is start thinking about what the optionality and what the consequences can be. So the thing that's interesting about Xlinks, I know you did ask me to do a party political broadcast.
I did, yeah.
I wasn't coming to
telling you
pitch
off for it.
Yeah, exactly. So the contract for difference that James mentioned that we're looking for Xlinks is £48 per kilowatt hour. Okay. Now, Bezos' forecast, mid-forecast, pre the summer, was that in the long term, the lowest cost of energy would be in the 50s. Right. So on a contract for difference that you talk about, it looks like under every scenario that you look at, Xlinks will be paying money to the government, right? So the government doesn't have to subsidize anything here. So in that sense, to your point, play all the scenarios you want, you don't have to.
But Dave, can I just ask one question? What happens if you say it's £48 and then it turns out it needs to be 58 or 65?
Well, that's That's where the risk is on the merchant in order to be able to provide. Yeah, exactly. Okay. But what you do here, and what the government can do, and it comes to the role of what is the government's role in terms of innovation, is the most efficient capital structure to raise the 16 billion that's required is the government's balance sheet. So the government, by saying we will buy this energy at this price, give you something that lowers the cost of capital beyond anything you could do in a commercial place. So what you really want government to do is put the balance sheet behind a project. We then raise the equity and the debt in the commercial markets, given that there's a guarantee that comes through, and you crack on. The interesting thing here is, look at it this way from a government point of view, the contract for difference for Xlinks is 48. The contract for difference for Hinkley is 92. Okay, so again, in terms of, even if you got it wrong a little bit, it's going to be way, way, way more. And to be honest, given the trends in tech, the only thing that's going to happen is the price is going to come down.
And they can, by the way, can they say, look, we've done a deal at 48 and we're going to bring it down to 48?
Well, this is what's happened with offshore wind and solar, which is each subsequent one comes down.
Jonathan, sorry, and will you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so Jonathan Oates from Drax. I'll spare everybody more geeky CFD chat. First point is, I think, just to kind of big thumbs up to Xlinks, because I think we're at the point now in terms of tackling the climate crisis where it has to be, you know, and when it comes to technology, every tool in the box, you know, whatever analogy you want to use. I guess my question is, I think we've covered, you know, today an energy crunch, we've covered, you know, a climate crunch, and we've covered a sort of food crunch. And there is a kind of a topic that sits at the intersect of all three, which is energy crops. And I just wondered what Dave's kind of view was on energy crops.
So what are energy crops, like
biofuels?
Biofuels.
Yeah. Look, honestly, having lived most of my life in development, the idea of producing food and turning it into energy when there are other opportunities is something I just purely personally struggle with.
What do you think, Jonathan?
I mean, that is obviously a kind of popular view, but I think there's another argument which says that, you know, actually a lot of energy crops do prosper and will grow on marginal land, which also isn't always kind of, you know, perfect condition, or doesn't always offer perfect conditions for the growth of food.
It's true. We can have a conversation later. I think that's the sort of land that ought to be part of the nature solution in terms of climate by bringing back biodiversity and other. But it's a purely personal point of view.
Frederick, I should come back to you. Do take the subtly branded mic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. No, I'd just like to raise, and I think the Xlinks project is wonderful. It actually points to the potential role of many North African countries in becoming energy producers for Europe, again, differently, and Southern Europe as well. And I'd just like to ask what your thought has been about hydrogen rather than cables to use this solar power and decarbonize several industries, because the technology is fast getting to a point where the cost of hydrogen will be probably quite interestingly cheaper than laying a cable for 15,000 kilometers.
We could have a very long conversation. The idea that renewable energy into the future will be used for hydrogen creation and storage, I think is absolutely there. I think if the analysis that we've done is given the timing that we're talking about is, we agree as a CFD with the government, this electricity will be here before the end of the decade. Right. So actually, if I take Xlinks versus the option you're talking about, one delivers 8% of the UK's electricity in a very short amount of time. Any hydrogen lead up is probably longer.
Technology is going fast.
No, technology is going fast, but the infrastructure to be able to use it here in the UK won't be ready by 2030.
Can I say one thing just before we wind up, Dave? I'm really conscious of the fact that we talk all about these big projects and not energy prices and petrol forecourts and basically the pigs in blankets crisis that we may be facing. I know you got this job on supply chains relatively recently, but how do you think about? And so I imagine you don't have like, this is the plan for dealing with it, but how do you approach a problem like that when the government says, can you look into it? What do you do?
So look, I've been asked to volunteer to try and help. So I've been doing it for just a little over 2 weeks. Yeah, exactly. Which is, look, so the way we're going about it is basically, so in the first week I met 15 different industries and just listen. You know, there's a load of expertise out there. The industries know their supply chains very, very, very well. So just be able to listen. In fairness to government, they've never really had to think about supply chains before. And if you think about it, government thinks vertically and supply chains work horizontally. So just being able to give some judgment to the feedback as to what's really important and what are the issues that cut across. So first thing, listen. It's a lot of business engagement to sort of listen. There's a bit of work going on to understand what's happened in the labour market. Now, it's interesting, I was listening to one of the podcasts this morning on the way in terms of the Great Resignation, and clearly something has happened in terms of where skills and numbers are, and we need to understand that. There's a piece of work that I'm not involved in, is also to think about the impact of what's happening in the energy market in terms of supply chains. And then what we're going to do, the idea, whilst we're not saying we've got the solution, is to think about how we might set up a mechanism that gives the government oversight, or insight and oversight, of the global supply chain as it affects the UK, because that doesn't exist at the minute in terms of setting up a supply chain advisory board. So there's a little bit of firefighting between now. So the idea is set up 3 horizons between now and the end of the year. There are some issues, so we need to fix them. Made quite a bit of progress. Next year we need to think about, and then 2023 and on, strategically, what ought we think about?
Okay, Dave, thank you. If you've been to, I don't know whether you worked in a newsroom before, but if you have, you'll know that what happens at the end of a meeting like this is we go, that's interesting, I think that's very clear, and then you turn to someone who's typically very smart and been thinking this through and say, well, actually, now what do we think? And in that spirit, I'm going to go to my colleague, Charles Mattel. So, Charles, what do we think? Yeah, you do, yeah. Where someone's... There you go, Luke. Sorry, Luke, I didn't get to come back to you. Okay, so Charles, what do we think?
So a leader needs a headline. This would be a double top leader, by the way. It would take up the top 2/3 of the page.
I should just explain, Charles and I worked at the Times together, so the way this used to work is we'd have a meeting like this and I'll ask Charles to write it.
Headline, the calorie question. So key data point at the top, the food and energy systems between them account for 70% of emissions. The closest thing that we had to a question to start all this, James, normally we have a written question, but this was technically an open news meeting, was, is this simply a technology/investment question? To which the answer, and we're now at the end of the first paragraph, which is the most important place in any editorial because people get that far, is yes. But if you leave it at that, then we're all screwed. Okay, food, very briefly, accounts for about half of those 70% of emissions. The good news is we can bring that down. The bad news is it's never happened before. No emissions reductions from the sector since 2008, and I suspect before that either. That's just...
I don't know.
Right. But we can turn that around by using technology, more pyramidal strawberries than vertical farming, James, changing our practice, which means avoiding food waste, changing our behavior, that means changing diet, and you can do both at once by cleaning your plate. But that points to the larger need for, which comes back to the end of the first paragraph, for regulation. China has showed role of government enforcing cleaning plate. We need role of government pricing carbon. Moving swiftly on to energy, is it a separate question, first of all? Is this a leader that hangs together? Yes, it is. Agriculture needs energy, energy needs land, and any solution, to your point, has to be and. We hear that over and over again in these conversations. So we know we have to decarbonize the entire power system. Intermittency here is a big problem. Xlinks, for example, is a solution. I have to bring in here a little bit of nerd knowledge from having looked into this. This has been tried before, as you'll know. Desertec, North Africa, from Libya across the Med.
Different system, yeah.
There are lots of bear traps, including country buy-in. It does seem in your case as if that might have been solved with the idea of Morocco itself wanting to be a renewables superpower. So I'd say also it's being tried, as you know, in Australia.
It's being tried now.
Yeah,
So
from
Northern Australia to Singapore,
to
same thing.
Singapore. The race is on, huh? It sounds like you're in a better position. I would have thought we would certainly make bold to say in an editorial, lessons from the past include make sure your host country is sufficiently incentivized. What applies to saving the Amazon applies equally when you're covering large parts of the Sahara with solar panels and wind powers. Because, and this is our final line, North and South, business and government and consumers, we're all in this together.
Very nice. Charles Whittle, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please do hang around. Thank you everyone who's joined us online. Personally, I'm going to take away one chilling statistic, which is that food waste was reduced by 27% in the lockdown. We probably used our time and our resources more intelligently than we have in a long time. And what that tells us about tomorrow and the rest of the week is probably rather chastening. But please join me in thanking Dave Lewis. I hope that, like me, you thought a lot and learned even more just listening to you, Dave. Thank you very much for joining.